Thank you. Well, thank you for coming. I know it's the end of the semester when all of us are tired, so I'm really glad that you could join us today to talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart. As a senior administrator now, I don't have a lot of opportunities to talk about things like this that for me are pure fun and bring me back to my beginnings as a graduate student. I started looking at the research on learning many, many years ago as a graduate student because I was given my own class to teach. And I was teaching at a university, Carnegie Mellon, which was very heavily engineering, robotics, computer science, and business. And so I was teaching a lot of students who were not excited or motivated to take my classes, although they were required. And a lot of students who really had bad experiences in history and had a lot of inaccurate information coming into my classroom. So all of these things sort of bubbled together. And I was talking to one of my history professors one day about my frustration that I wasn't doing a very good job. And he sent me over to our psychology department, which at the time and still today focuses in the area of cognitive psychology and a bunch of people who study learning. And so one of those people took me under his wing, started sharing the research on learning with me that he thought would be appropriate for my courses. So he would give me some articles to read, and I would go back the next week to say, well, I read these, and I think I'm going to try this in my course and that in my course. And we ended up doing that both throughout my time as a graduate student, but eventually he became my mentor for more than 25 years. And so I ended up staying after my degree at Carnegie Mellon because I had been taking the research and translating it into my own course design and design of activities in the classroom. And I was asked to share that with other faculty who found it helpful. And things just built from there. Our center was created, we got an endowment, and it was all beautiful and wonderful. And so the research, and particularly these principles, are important to me because they've had such a big impact on my life. And so what I want to do today, this afternoon, is to set the context for why this approach. I've given you a little bit of history. I want to briefly introduce the 7 principles of learning. And as I'm talking about the principles, which are not rocket science, I would like for you to think about how, where, when they resonate with you. And I say that because I've talked about these principles literally around the world. And the fun thing about this is that my colleagues in forums like this always have aha moments. They have aha moments saying, aha, now I know why that technique or strategy or approach works with that group of students, and now I know why I struggle when I try to do this kind of thing with this group of students. And so I want you to think about that, because once I present the principles very briefly, I'd like you in small tables to talk about either examples of the principles, strategies, techniques, approaches that you've used as either a student or a faculty member, and or generate some principles that one could use in their classroom, studio, or lab. And then I want to share those strategies, because when you've got the brain power like we have in this room, it's really, I think, important to tap into what a lot of you are already doing, or some ideas that you get as a result of me talking for a few minutes. And then hopefully we'll have time for questions and discussion. So in my mind, we've got an hour and a half together. I hope that by the time you leave, there's one principle that you really resonate with, so much so that you could walk out and explain it to somebody and give them some examples from your own experience. And then at least one principle that you really think could be the source of some of the struggles your students are having that you want to learn more about in order to rectify the situation. So the context. I came across this quote a few years ago from George Koo, who is an educator himself, a faculty member, who essentially called us, those of us who teach at colleges and universities, well-intentioned, gifted amateurs. And I thought that was really appropriate for those of us who have been trained in our discipline, and because we know our discipline, are put in the classroom with the assumption that we understand both learning and teaching. And I thought that was really interesting because it was certainly not my experience, and as I got into faculty development work early on, I realized it was not the experience of most most people, most faculty members. And so I always remembered this, and I think the good news about faculty is that not only are we well-intentioned, gifted amateurs, but we're really smart people. And I learned very early on that if you share how learning works, how people take in information, process it, organize it in a way that they can then retrieve it and use it flexibly and fluently down the road, you present that to faculty, they are smart enough to figure out how to use that as they design courses and other educational experiences for students. And so that's always stuck with me. As a result of that, what I've always focused on with my colleagues has been the research on learning, and there is a lot of research on learning. When I started looking at the research 30-some years ago, at that time there was a lot of research. It came out of fields of education, it came out of the field of cognitive psychology, social psychology, came out of organizational behavior, some of it came out of educational anthropology and cultural anthropology. So there was a whole lot of stuff out there. And I was really surprised to find out that there was all of this really good research out there, which nobody was talking to faculty about 35 years ago. And so what I have done over the years is really try to look at that research and translate it to make it easily digestible to people who don't have the time or inclination to look at that research. So these principles are broadly applicable. They have been used across ages and stages. My work has always focused at the college level. I have no experience at K through 12, and yet the book has been used in all of the countries that it's been translated in with both university and college professors, but also K through 12 teachers. And so that we never meant for that to happen, but we all know a learner is a learner is a learner. We continue to learn throughout life and the principles hold true. And it's been used across contexts, both cultural contexts, but more importantly for what we're talking about today, disciplinary context. And they are generative. I have never been a person who thinks that it's helpful to just provide strategies, approaches, and techniques, because my experience is that strategies, approaches, and techniques often don't work across all contexts. So it's more important to understand how learning actually works so that you can choose the appropriate strategy, approach, or technique. Since I'm going to be talking about learning, that's what the session focuses on, I want to just very quickly give you the definition that I think of when I think of learning. We adapted it from Rich Mayer, who's a cognitive psychologist at UC Santa Barbara, and has done a lot of amazing research in learning. And the definition that we subscribe to is that learning is a process that leads to change, which occurs as a result of experience and increases the potential for improved performance and future learning. And I've broken that down into three critical components that I think are important for us to note. The first is that learning is a process, not a product. And while that might seem like a no-brainer to you because you watch your students as they learn throughout the semester, many of you might agree that our students think of learning as the product. They think of learning as that artifact, the paper, the bridge they've designed, the musical composition they've written. It is that artifact which results in a grade. And so often for them, that's what captures the learning. And we all know that the grade doesn't often capture the learning that goes on in the mind of the student. And so it's really important that we understand that we need to help our students understand that learning is a process, that learning is sometimes difficult, that it's gradual, that it takes iteration, and a whole lot of other things that I'm going to talk about, but that it's a process. And if they're focusing only on the grade and that product, they're potentially missing out on something that's going to be really vital as they move into their lives and careers over the next 30, 40, 50 years. Learning also involves change. That change can be in knowledge, beliefs, behaviors, or attitudes, but that change has to have a lasting impact. So cramming for an exam, doing well on the exam, and then walking into this next course in the sequence the following semester and not remembering anything, is that learning? Well, many of us would say, no, it's not. That learning has to involve change, and that change has to be long-lasting. By the way, Joe has the slides and you're welcome to them. So take notes if you like, but you have access to the slides. The reason why it's really important that we think about how learning works is because we know that learning happens in the minds of the learners. So I'm going to say that again. Learning happens in the minds of the learners. And the degree to which we can impact learning is the degree to which we can create the conditions that get students to engage in the behaviors that lead to learning. And so no matter how brilliant your course is, no matter how amazing you've created the activities, no matter how wonderful the feedback you give students is, if they don't engage in all of those things, learning does not occur. And so this notion that students have got to take more responsibility for their learning, something that many of them are still uncomfortable with because they're used to us being the expert, giving them the knowledge. And so when you decide not to engage in that giving any longer, students can be really uncomfortable with it. But this notion that we have to help them understand that it happens in their minds, and we can help by creating conditions that get them to engage in the behaviors, but the responsibility is really theirs. It's theirs because everything that the learner brings with them, prior knowledge, by which I mean everything, formal and informal, life experience, values, attitudes, beliefs, the goals they have, everything that a learner brings with them as they walk into our labs, our studios, or our classrooms, impact how they see information, how they take it in, how they organize it, and whether or not they're going to be able to retrieve it and use it fluently and flexibly in new context. And that's what we're all teaching toward. We want our students to be able to take the skills, the knowledge, the approaches, the attitudes, the frameworks, whatever, and we want them to be able to use it when they need it. And when they get into other courses or out into the world, they're going to need to access that information, and that's only, or those skills, and that's only going to happen if that long-lasting change has actually occurred. So, this really is a different way to think about what we do in the classroom, to not start with what is it we need to teach in order to get them through the curriculum, but what is it students need to learn? How can we assure that they learn that so that they can progress in their thinking, in their intellectual development, social emotional development, so that they can then get out in the world and do good? So what I want to do is very briefly go through these 7 principles. They are not in any particular order. They could tell a story in any order. Number 1 is not more important than number 7. And they all interact. They're all interconnected. And in fact, whenever you get to the point where you're talking about strategies, techniques, or approaches to some of these, what you'll find is that often a strategy, a technique, or approach can align with more than one of these principles. And that's why I'm not going to stop after each one and have a conversation, but wait until you have all 7 to ask you to engage in that conversation. So we're going to start with prior knowledge. You need to think of prior knowledge as the lens through which we take in all incoming information. And that lens is very personal to every learner. And that lens is based on life experience, formal education, informal education, attitudes, beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. And the good news is that the prior knowledge is often the foundation or the building blocks for future knowledge, right? So it's really important that that prior knowledge students have is accurate, appropriate, sufficient, and activated. And the good news is that a lot of students come to college with a lot of prior information that is accurate, appropriate, sufficient, and activated. However, you all know in your teaching situations that often students come in with some knowledge, attitude, or belief that's inaccurate, and that's usually, as a disciplinary expert, pretty easy for faculty to recognize. They come in and they think they know something, and it's simply wrong. What's more subtle and just as important is that students often come into our classrooms, labs, studios with accurate information, but they use it inappropriately, or it's insufficient, or it's inactive. They have it, they know it somewhere back in their brain, but they don't actually use it, they don't activate it. Those are often not as easy to diagnose, if you will, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute. And so it's really important when we think about understanding what our students' prior knowledge is that we can differentiate. Because while it's difficult to break through inaccurate knowledge, it's very easy to at least diagnose inaccurate knowledge. So, inappropriate knowledge is accurate knowledge that is used at the wrong time. And so the example I often give is very early on in my career, a frustration of a colleague of mine who was teaching a biology course where there was a lab. And despite giving students directions on how to write a lab report, she was getting all kinds of other stuff from her freshmen. She was getting the notorious 5-paragraph essay that they learned to write in high school. She was getting wonderfully flowery, creative writing type things because this was the era in which a lot of high schools had moved to teaching students creative writing. What she wasn't getting was the analytical kind of writing that she needed for the lab report. So it's not that those other kind of writings were wrong, they were used at the wrong time. Often, if you think about inappropriate also, there are often cultural things. So there are lots of students who come to the US to study from countries where you would never ask a question in a classroom. Because if you ask a question of a professor, you are implying the professor didn't give a good explanation. Well, we don't subscribe to that in the US, and we want our students to be thinking and asking questions. And so they're doing it based on what is culturally appropriate in their country, but not in the States. So that's what inappropriate is.
Do you think it's worse for there to be a blank slate where they have no context of what you're trying to teach, or for them to have gone off in the wrong direction?
Well, yeah, so I don't know if it can ever be a blank slate because people have life experience. So even if they never took, physics or statistics or economics in high school, they still have a sense of what that is. So they still come with some kind of preconceived notions. So I'm not sure, but can a little bit of wrong knowledge be worse than a lot of wrong knowledge? Sure, right, because you have more that you have to undo, right? And having to undo it takes time, but not undoing it means they're building on a very shaky and inaccurate or insufficient foundation.
Does it take as much time, does it take like twice as much time to back them off the wrong knowledge to get them on the right track?
So for the inaccurate knowledge, yes. For the other three, no. So for the inaccurate knowledge, if they have held that belief or that, fact to be true for a long time, then it's much harder to turn them around. And there are strategies to do that to help them see why it's wrong. So that's harder, that's easier to diagnose, harder to deal with. The other three are harder to diagnose, easier to deal with. So, good question though. Insufficient knowledge. So insufficient knowledge is, I have a little bit of knowledge and it's accurate, but it's not enough. So often we talk about three kinds of knowledge: declarative, procedural, and contextual. Declarative knowledge are the facts. They're things you can memorize. Procedural knowledge is actually engaging in that. So I might be able to describe what a derivative is, and now I know I can show you I can do it. And the contextual knowledge is I know when to use the things that I know. So those are the different kinds of knowledge. When you ask students sometimes, as people do in the classroom at the beginning of the course, how many of you know X, whatever X is? The scales, supply and demand, Kirchhoff's law, whatever it is. How many of you know X? And a bunch of students put up their hands. What you may not realize is that no to students means oftentimes, I heard it once, I saw it in a book, right? That's what no is. What you're asking is, you know it. You know what it is, you know how to use it, you know when to use it. So there's often a disconnect when we generically ask students what they know, right? And so that's very easy to deal with, but often it takes a little time to diagnose what is insufficient about what it is they know. And then there's inactive knowledge. Inactive knowledge, like inappropriate and insufficient, is accurate, but in the case of inactive, it is not activated. It is somewhere in their long-term memory, and if it were activated, they could use it, but it's not activated. And the best example that I give of that is as I traveled around the world talking about these principles, Over and over again, I heard from engineering professors how dismal the state of physics was, because everybody in engineering is required to take a physics course, and then they come into their first engineering course, and it looks like nobody learned anything in physics. And I remember hearing that when I was in the States, and then when I started to realize it was an international phenomena and started to look into it more, what the case was that the physics faculty were teaching physics within the construct and context of physics, and students didn't even recognize as total novices that they were going to have to use that when they got into their first engineering course or their first architecture course, right? And so they weren't learning it for transfer, they were learning it because they had to take it, it was a required course. And so they had the knowledge, it wasn't activated. And the thing about inactive knowledge is you can activate it like this. All you need to do is say to students in your first architecture course or engineering course, you're going to be using a lot of the concepts that you learned in Physics 1. So, you may want to go back and maybe review those. By simply saying that, students, when they sit down to problem solve in their engineering or architecture course, immediately start looking back in their long-term memory for those physics concepts that would be appropriate. So you can activate it very easily. So the point of this is that students always come into our courses with knowledge, skills, facts, models, attitudes, beliefs, assumptions about everything, no matter how naive they are, or even if they haven't had experience. And if we don't take account for that, then we can try to build on a foundation that's really shaky. So it's really important to figure out what it is students know, and then to assure that we're addressing the inactive, the insufficient, the inaccurate, and the inappropriate. And there are lots of ways that one can go about doing that. Hopefully you've had some experience, some of you in this, that you'll be able to share with us. Now, people become experts not only because they have a whole lot of that prior knowledge, but people who are experts have organized knowledge in a way that they can pull it out when they need it and use it. And everybody in this room is probably an expert defined by either 10,000 hours or 10 years of full-time experience engaged in your profession or your discipline. And what we don't realize as experts is that we walk around with these organizational structures in our mind about our field, about the subfield we may be in, about our courses. We think in pictures, but they're so much a part of who we are that we are not even, this is not foremost in our mind. We don't even recognize or realize we do this. We have these rich, meaningful knowledge structures. Some people call them mental models. And that's the way we view the world. And all new information that comes in for those of us who are experts in our fields comes in and connects to something else, which continues to expand the rich, meaningful knowledge structures. What we know about novices is that novices will organize because that's what the human brain does. It gets lots of information, the human brain will organize. The problem is they'll organize it in sparse, superficial ways which aren't helpful to our long-term goal, which is to be able to have students take the knowledge and the skills they gain and use them fluently and flexibly when they get out into the world in new, authentic contexts. So organization of knowledge is really important. A colleague of mine, Fred Reif, who studied physics, he was a physicist, studied a whole lot of students, first in physics and then in some of the other sciences, and I always liked his depiction of what he saw. So what is, and then I should say this research was then replicated in other disciplines, but what is typical of novices is this kind of superficial way of organizing things. So think about this as your course, and this is what they learned on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. None of it is connected. My belief is that no one in this room creates a course like that, right? It's integrated and it builds. But in this case, that's how students view it. Or at larger universities where students, particularly in the sciences, have lecture, recitation, and lab. Think about this as lecture, recitation, and lab. Sorry state of affairs if students don't see how those three things are connected, right? Or students think of organization of knowledge as very sequential. I'm a historian by training, so this is how students view history. 1789, 1790, 1791, right? That this is the way they learn to view history. It's not an appropriate nor helpful construct. As opposed to experts who create organizational structures that work for them in their field, that allow them to always take in new information, expand, at the same time being able to use that information when they need it. So you will notice in some science disciplines, this might be an appropriate organizational structure. If you're looking at minerals or ores, you may notice this is much sloppier, but in disciplines, well, in many disciplines, but in my discipline of history, this is what our organizational models look like. Because if you're studying the history of the United States in the late early 1900s, immigration, industrialization, and urbanization did not happen sequentially. They were happening all at the same time. So it's really important for us to remember that organization is what allows people to pull out information they need when they need it. And yet, we usually don't focus as faculty on helping students to understand that, or even doing things in our courses like exposing our own organizational structures that could help students learn how to organize. In my mind, you know, they have all of these techniques which really bother me. I will tell you my bias here on how to take notes, but they're always still about words. You know, draw a line down the paper and take your notes, then go back and put keywords. What note-taking should be about is actually drawing pictures of how all the things connect to what you previously know, to what you're hearing, and potentially to what's coming next. And we don't spend time actually doing what could be more helpful to students so that they really, at a deep level, own knowledge. Now, in order to get students to really think about their prior knowledge, how it connects, how they're building, we want to get them involved, motivated to engage in the behaviors that lead to learning. So remember I said at the beginning, learning happens in the minds of the learners. And the degree to which we can impact that is to create an atmosphere, to create our learning experiences to get students to engage in those behaviors. Well, what we know is that students only engage in the behaviors that lead to learning if they believe, expect to be successful, and if they believe the information, the skills, the frameworks are relevant, they hold some value, either short-term or long-term. So if the students taking physics are told you absolutely need to learn this physics in order to be an engineer or an architect, their attitude and their behavior changes. And we did studies like that at Carnegie Mellon. Immediately changed, became incredibly engaged, and tried to develop mastery by doing problem after problem after problem because they understood the value or the relevancy in the short term. And the research shows it can be short term or long term, but they have to see it. But the other issue is expectancy. Students engage in learning behaviors that lead to learning if they expect to be successful. So in the United States, and actually it's really funny, I never use this example abroad, ever, whether India, Taiwan, China, never. In the United States, we still have many little girls who believe they can't do math. It's still a problem, and it's the number one reason why little girls don't go into science and engineering, because they can't do math. And it turns out when you talk to those little girls, who then become high school students, who then become college-age students, when you talk to them, they will often tell you, well, I was never good in math, I just don't have it. Some will even say, I just don't have that math gene, okay? We all know there's not a gene for math. When you drill down, what you will learn is they were never good in math, and they define that as they got B's or C's in math. So their expectation is, I'm not good in math, I don't have the gene. You know, what they're really saying is intelligence is fixed, I don't have it, I can't do it. As a result, they don't go to office hours, they don't go to peer tutors, they don't join study groups, they don't get on Khan Academy and look at a concept again if they didn't understand it, because they believe even if they do all those things, I'm not going to be successful. So in fact, because they don't have an expectation for success coming out of their previous experience, they don't engage in the exact behaviors that would lead to success. Conversely, if I believe I didn't have a very good physics teacher, and as a result, I didn't do well in physics, but it was him, not me, then what I potentially do is join a study group, get on and do extra problems, go to my professor's office hours. I engage in the behaviors that lead to learning. So what's key to me about motivation is that it's all about students' beliefs and perceptions. And I know that there is this people with whom I disagree who say it's really difficult to change beliefs and perceptions of 18 to 22-year-olds, and I just fundamentally disagree with that. A lot of the issues around expectancy come from not having been successful. And you can build opportunities for people to gain some early successes, which build their confidence. And we all know that once somebody's confidence is building up, they feel good about it, then they're willing to try more as they build their competence. And the more competent they become, the more confident. It's this wonderful upward spiral. So the degree to which we can have conversations with our students to understand what their expectations are, which will tell us a lot about how they view themselves, their ability, how they define intelligence and learning, the more we're going to be able to respond appropriately. And the more we understand that, in fact, while we may see the relevance and value and think it's really obvious to our students, because I would guess that no one here teaches anything that you view to be irrelevant or not of value, right? It's all relevant and of value. That's why you choose to include it in your course. But because it's so obvious to you doesn't mean it's obvious to students. So that intentionality of having conversations with students about the value is incredibly important. This one to me is very interesting because we all know from our own experience that you learn what you practice and only what you practice. No matter what it is you're good at, and in the case of students, it could be playing a musical instrument, it could be playing video games, it could be playing sports. Students, by the time they come into our classrooms, have accomplished, most of them, something that they feel really good about. And when you ask them how they became a really good skateboarder, a really good basketball player, a really good pianist, they will tell you easily and explicitly, practice, practice, practice with a really good coach or a really good piano teacher who gave me feedback, and then I learned from that person, and then I went in and I did things differently. So they know it from their own experience. The problem is they often don't translate that into their experience in the classroom or in their courses. And so they don't like to do problem sets every week, and they don't like to have to do 3 iterations of a composition, or they don't like to have to continually do these things, which sometimes they think of as busy work. And yet when you explain to them that you learn what you practice and only what you practice, combined with targeted constructive feedback, they get it. And so this notion that we have to be more intentional by helping students to understand that they practice toward goals, that we observe them and give them feedback toward those goals, because in fact we want them to master the way they've mastered other things. And that word mastered brings us to this whole issue of mastery, that what we're trying to do in all of our courses is help students master something. It might be master with a small m versus master with a big M, depending on where you're teaching in the curriculum. I want them to master some concepts, or I want them as a doctoral student to master a field or a subfield. But the thing that's interesting about mastery, and all of us have gone through this, is the way you develop mastery typically is that you acquire knowledge and component knowledge and skills, and then you learn to integrate those things. You pull them together when you need them, and then you learn when to apply. So in some respects, this models what I said before, the declarative knowledge, which is often the factual stuff, the procedural, which is integrating and using, and the contextual, which is knowing when to apply. And what's interesting about this model is that the more expert you are, the more difficult it is to try and break down what it is you know to those component skills. And there's been a lot of research in this area. It's difficult because of expert blind-spot. The more expert you are, the more things have become certain things have become incredibly easy for you to do, and you do those things without thinking, and that frees up a cognitive load to allow you to do other things. So if you take something as simple as we all learned our multiplication tables, because you can do that quickly, if you're working on a problem, you can attend to other things, more sophisticated things. So what we know about experts across a whole variety of fields is that experts tend to overestimate what novices know and can do, in some respects because it comes so easy to us and we forget how long it took us to get there. They underestimate how long it will take. How many of you have spent endless amount of time saying, I've created this exam or this quiz, it takes me 10 minutes to do it, how long should it take students to do it? I mean, that's an impossible situation, by the way, and really difficult to try and model. But at least if you start to think about expert novice, that should give you kind of some indication. Experts and novices, experts often don't see the steps or pieces in whatever it is they're doing because they all kind of get smushed together. So from my own discipline in history, we tell students, to define a topic and then to go and do research on that topic. And we forget all of the steps that go into finding a good research question first, and then figuring out what databases you need to access, and then understanding who are prominent in the field. I mean, there are so many sub-steps that we mush together that oftentimes it makes it difficult for us to actually teach as well as we could to give as full explanations as we need. Often mispredict where novices will have difficulty. I mean, how many of you have had the experience where you thought this part of the course would be really challenging and it wasn't, and you thought this would be really easy and it wasn't for the students? And so, all of these things come out of our expert blind spot. And one way to think about our expert blind spot, the difference between novice and experts, is this mastery in terms of consciousness and competence. So if you think about coming new to anything, it could be new to the discipline, new to a course, or it could be you're learning to play the piano, or you're learning to drive stick shift for the first time. You're at a state of unconscious incompetence, which means you don't know what you don't know. And when you are so new to something that you're at a state of unconscious incompetence, you can't even ask a question. When you get to the state of conscious incompetence, you know what you don't know. You know what you're not understanding, and that's the point where you can start asking questions. When you get to the state of conscious competence, you can do it, whatever it is, but it takes a lot of time, effort, and concentration, but you can do it. And then when you get to the state of unconscious competence, that's the state of expertise, you do things without even thinking about it. Now, if you look at that and you're teaching true novices, on both ends of the spectrum, you see that the faculty and the students are unconscious for different reasons, right? What we need to do as experts is we need to move back to this state of conscious competence when we were in grad school learning it all. And what we need to do is move our students to this first leap so that they can begin to ask questions in our courses. And to me, this was a real, eye-opener when I started thinking about the students that were coming into my courses. Up to this point, those first 5 really focused on students as cognitive beings, intellectual beings, right? But it's really important that we remember and think about our students as who they are, as what they embody, and that when they walk into our classrooms, they're not purely intellectual beings, they're human beings, social, emotional beings, and particularly with 18 to 23-year-olds, there are a whole lot of things going on in their lives. We all continue to development. There's lots of research on development that goes all the way into adulthood. We never stop developing. But for this age group, 18 to 22 or 23, when they're leaving home for the first time, starting to think about who they want to be, a lot is going on. And the climate that we create in our classrooms, in our lab studios, on our campuses, is really important in terms of what it is they're going to walk away with. And so it's really important that we acknowledge that we are not teaching content, we are teaching students. the content and the skills that go along with it. And that a lot of things are going on. Besides developing competence, they're learning to manage emotions. They're away from home. They're meeting new people, people whose attitudes and beliefs may be different from their own. They're trying to develop autonomy away from their parents. They're establishing their identity, maybe for the first time in their lives. Freeing interpersonal relationships, developing purpose and integrity. There is a whole lot going on that I think even when we were undergraduates, we weren't all that cognizant of. But there's a lot of research now that tells us that a remark that is viewed as belittling in a classroom for someone who isn't quite sure she can do math can actually send her into a tailspin and decide that I really can't be an engineer. Or, a joke that may, at the expense of someone, or examples that are gendered. So a lot of, again, I'll go back to women in engineering and science because it was one of my big research areas. A lot of women who left engineering and science courses left them because a lot of the examples that were used in textbooks as well as in classrooms were around sports or cars. Right? Some of that has changed now, and those are superficial features of a problem. But when someone sees something like that, instead of looking at a deep level, what they say is, well, I don't know anything about football, so how am I going to understand the trajectory of, right? Has nothing to do with football, but those superficial features of examples turned a lot of people off. So it's really important that we remember that. And as I said before, around students as social emotional beings are things like how they think about intelligence, learning, and knowledge. Those can get in the way. The more elite a school is, the higher the SAT scores a school has, the more the school is likely to get students who did not struggle in their high school, maybe were not challenged. And so the truth is a lot of those students will tell you that learning in their minds was quick and easy because that's what they experienced all their lives. Now they come to a university, learning isn't quick and easy, and sometimes what they do is leave a field because they believe it's them, or they have to totally sort of rethink what learning is. And I can tell you that was a lot of the kind of students that we saw at Carnegie Mellon who would come with 1,600 SATs, which in my mind means they're really good test takers. They've mastered that skill. But those were kids who never struggled at all. And then they show up in college where the stakes are higher, there's more information coming at you at a faster pace, and a lot of students really struggled. I did a session out at Stanford not long ago for the faculty, and the students asked to come when they saw the flyers. And when the students came, every student in the room talked about, at some point disclosed, how much they struggled their first semester a year at Stanford. And it was exactly this phenomena, that it had always come easy to them, so all of a sudden it wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, and they started to think about whether or not they belonged there. So it's really important that we understand how students think about these things. And then finally, if you're dealing with adult returning professionals, just because they're adults, again, doesn't mean they've stopped developing, and they come with their own set of issues. Being in control of a job and a family during the day and coming to school at night. Not, being autonomous during the day and being a student, who doesn't have that kind of autonomy at night. Struggling with confidence and competence if they haven't been in school for a long time. These people tend to be much more focused and care even more about relevancy because they have all of these other life commitments. So the issue here is just to remember that our students don't leave their selves outside of the classroom. They don't come in just as intellectual beings, but as people who lead holistic, rich lives. And we need to at least be aware of that because it can impact the learning that goes on. And then finally, I talked about one of the things that we all have in common, no matter the discipline or where we teach, is that we're teaching for transfer. We want people to be able to take what they're learning in our courses and carry those to other courses or to their first, second, third, and fourth jobs out in the world, right? And in order to be able to do that, students really need to become self-directed learners, because up until the time they leave college or grad school, depending on how long they go to school, they have always been in structured learning environments. When you get out into the workplace, a huge amount of learning in the workplace happens in the workplace, where you're given a task, you are not sure how to do it, and you've got to figure it out. And figuring it out might mean you have to go learn some things on your own. Then you need to know where to go to learn them and how to monitor the learning that's happened. Or you need to be able to pull together a team of people, so you need to recognize other people's expertise. This process of self-directed learning is something that all of you engage in all the time without realizing it. So it's another part of the sort of expertise that when you need to learn something new or you're given a task, typically what you do as an expert without even realizing it is you assess the task. What was I asked to do? What new research area do I want to move into? What do I know? What don't I know? The strengths and weaknesses. How am I going to fill for that? Am I going to have to learn it? Can I bring someone in on the team? What is the plan? As I'm going through doing whatever it is I'm doing, am I monitoring my performance and changing whatever needs to be changed along the way? And then finally, in the end, when I'm finished, stepping back and assessing what it is I've just done. And what we know about all of you, all of us, is that we do this without thinking about it. And I'll give you one example at the far end, the reflect and adjust if needed. And that's that there's a lot of research that shows that experts, even when they've done something incredibly successful, still step back and say, what would I do different the next time? And the example I always give is whether or not you have had the experience where you're sending in a proposal or a journal article or a paper, or you've just given a great talk at a conference, and the minute it's done, the minute you hit the button or you step off the stage, you go, oh, I should have done this, I should have said this, I should have included this, right? We've all done it. How many of your students hand in a paper or that problem set and then go, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that? Not many of them. And part of that is that they haven't learned to reflect in that way. I mean, it's a skill that you learn, and they haven't learned to reflect in that way. And so it's really important that we start to think about how this happens. At the other end of the spectrum, assessing the task, a lot of the expert novice across lots of disciplines and the games of chess and Go show what experts and novices do when they're given a task or a problem. And what the novices, who are always college students, would do is immediately pull out their computer, pick up their pen, and start working. Whereas the experts would sit, anywhere from 3 to 10, 15 minutes, not doing anything but thinking about what the problem is or what the task is before they ever try to get it. So again, how do we build that kind of thing into what it is we're doing? The good news, I should flip this. The good news is a lot of adults do have this self-directed learning metacognitive, and they've learned it as adults. And so that's the good news. The bad news is that most early college students don't have it because they've never learned it. And you learn it along the way, right? We eventually all learned it. Some of us maybe in our later years in our doctoral work. But the question is, if we know how important this is, can't we design some of our educational activities to help students learn it sooner, because it would behoove them to do so? So those are the principles at a glance. And now what I would like for you to do in your table, so you can join someone at another table, Diane, what I'd like you to do is actually, choose a couple of the principles and either share a strategy that you've used, and I'm going to leave those up, that you've used to address one of them, either as a faculty member or as a student, because this often prompts, I had a professor once who did blah, 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 and now I know why that was effective. Or if you don't have examples at the ready, generate them. How could you assess prior knowledge, help students learn to organize, tap into the value relevancy kind of stuff? So spend about 20 minutes, and then I want to have time to share as a group, because we really want to take advantage of the brain power here. And my experience always is that you just need to share with faculty how learning works, and people have great examples and ideas about how to use this in the courses that they're teaching. So, 20 minutes, I'll give you a 2-minute warning, and I'll ask somebody at each table to give it an example of one or two of the strategies you've discussed.